My brother looked across the dinner table and said, "I did not deserve our family name." My mother agreed. My father stayed silent. Everyone expected me to cry. Instead, my grandfather slowly stood up and said, "Then she will carry mine and everything that comes with it." My brother's smile disappeared instantly when he realized what Grandpa really meant. Nya, 30 years old, and my family had absolutely no clue who I really was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. The air in my parents' sprawling Chicago penthouse was thick with the scent of tradition and the suffocating weight of generational wealth. It was the first Sunday of the month, a sacred time in the Dubois family. We were gathered around a massive custom mahogany dining table that could comfortably seat 20 people. Above us, an enormous crystal chandelier cast a warm amber glow over the room, illuminating the original paintings by renowned Black artists that lined the walls. My parents loved to display these pieces of our culture, even though they spent every waking moment trying to distance themselves from the very community those artists represented. The table was groaning under the weight of a classic Sunday dinner. The steam was still rising from a massive ceramic baking dish of my mother's famous 4-cheese baked macaroni and cheese. There, it were platters piled high with perfectly seasoned fried chicken, deep bowls of slow-braised, collard greens with smoked turkey, buttery cornbread, still warm from the oven, and sweet candied yams glistening under the dining room lights. For any other family, this would be a feast of love and connection. For the Dubois family, it was just another stage for my brother Trey to exercise his dominance. I was quietly cutting the piece of chicken, enjoying the rare moment of silence when a thick, heavy stack of legal documents suddenly slammed onto the table. The sudden noise echoed through the grand dining room like a gunshot. Trey had tossed the heavy file across the polished oak wood with such aggressive force that it violently struck my crystal water glass. The glass tipped dangerously, sloshing ice-cold water over the rim and soaking directly into the pristine white linen tablecloth right next to my plate. I did not flinch. I slowly set down my fork and knife. I watched the water pool and spread across the expensive fabric before lifting my eyes to look at my brother. Trey was sitting directly across from me, leaning back in his tall leather chair with the careless arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire 34 years of life. He was the undisputed golden child of the Dubois Empire. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most people make in 6 months. His posture radiating a toxic blend of corporate greed and unearned entitlement, he served as the director of the Dubois Investment Fund, a title my parents essentially handed to him on a silver platter the moment he graduated. "Sign it," Trey commanded. His voice was flat, sharp, and stripped of any familial warmth. He pointed a manicured finger at the damp stack of legal papers resting by my plate. "Sign the relinquishment forms. Nya, you are giving up your shares in the family trust fund, effective immediately." The entire dining room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. I looked down at the top page of the document. The bold, legal text was demanding my absolute surrender of my birthright. They were asking me to voluntarily erase my financial existence from the Dubois legacy. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his demand, the soft, deliberately sweet voice of his wife cut through the silence. "It really is for the best," Nia Harper said. Harper was my 2-year-old sister-in-law. She was a wealthy white woman from a prominent political family, and she possessed an absolute mastery of weaponized fragility. She loved to play the innocent, well-meaning victim while delivering the most devastating racially coded microaggressions imaginable. She sat next to Trey with perfect posture, her blonde hair flawlessly styled, wearing a pastel designer dress that made her look like a catalog model for affluent suburban wives. Harper reached out with a delicate hand and adjusted the stem of her wine glass, offering me a smile that was so fake it practically cracked her face. Trey and I are in the final stages of securing land for our new luxury resort project. She continued, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. It is going to be a massive undertaking, a world-class destination, right here in the city. But the board requires us to show overwhelming liquidity. We need to consolidate the family capital to secure the development rights. We simply need to mobilize your portion of the trust fund to make this vision a reality. I leaned back in my velvet chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sweet tea. I kept my face entirely impassive. Inside my mind, I was calculating every frown, angle, observing every micro-expression around the table. They honestly believed I was just going to hand over millions of dollars because they asked. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a failure because I had refused to join the family investment firm, choosing instead to open my own independent consulting agency. They assumed my business was a struggling, insignificant little passion project. They had no idea that I was actually a crisis public relations and financial fixer for the global elite. They had no idea that I personally managed damage control and shadow investments for billionaires, moving amounts of money that would make Trey's entire luxury resort project look like a child's lemonade stand. Honestly, Nia, Harper sighed softly, placing a hand on her chest as if she were deeply pained by the conversation. You have to understand our position. Your little community projects are just not aligning with the Dubois brand anymore. All those initiatives you run down in the slums, those neighborhood centers and youth programs, they are a really bad look for a family of our stature. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle over me. The camera in my mind pushed in slowly on Harper's smug, condescending face. She had just referred to the historic black neighborhoods where my grandfather had started his very first business as slums. She was sitting in a house paid for by generational wealth, generated from those exact streets. And she was casually insulting the people who lived there. We are elevating the family name to a new tier of high society. Harper went on, taking a sip of her expensive red wine. Especially now that Trey is laying the groundwork for his city council run next year. We need to project elite, untouchable success to our investors and the political donors. Your struggling neighborhood charities and your insistence on associating with that element just drag down our family reputation. It makes us look common. You do understand that, do you not? Sweetie, I looked at her, watching the way she batted her eyelashes, completely convinced of her own superiority. She was asking me to fund her gentrification project while actively degrading the community I loved. She wanted to erase the history of the Dubois family and replace it with a sterilized, whitewashed country club aesthetic. Trey nodded in agreement with his wife, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. You have been playing savior for years. Yeah. And where has it gotten you? He sneered. You are 30 years old and you have nothing to show for it. No real career. No political influence. No real money. Dad and Mom have spent years covering for your embarrassing career choices, telling their friends, you are just finding yourself. Well, the time for finding self is over. The family needs this capital to grow. You are going to sign those papers today, or you are going to find yourself entirely cut off from this family. I slowly turned my gaze from Trey to my parents, waiting to see if they would intervene. I waited it to see if my mother would defend me, or if my father would remind Trey that the trust fund was set up by Pops to ensure all his grandchildren were protected equally. They did absolutely nothing. My mother, Lorraine, just stared down at her plate of food. refusing to meet my eyes. Her silence speaking volumes about where her loyalties truly rested. My father, Elias, simply swirled the ice in his whiskey glass, looking mildly annoyed that this business transaction was interrupting his Sunday dinner. They had made their choice. They were sacrificing their daughter to feed the endless, insatiable greed of their golden son. The silence in the dining room stretched out heavy and suffocating. The air felt charged with electricity. I looked down at the legal document one more time. The paper was crisp, the legal jargon dense and aggressive. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat against the document. I could feel Trey's triumphant gaze on me. He thought he had won. He thought he had cornered the weak, helpless little sister. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. I was about to find out just how disastrously wrong he was. The scrape of heavy silver against fine bone china suddenly shattered the suffocating tension in the room. My mother, Lorraine, broke the silence with a deliberate, calculated movement that spoke volumes about her priorities. She reached across the massive mahogany table with the ornate silver serving tongs, completely bypassing my empty plate. Instead, she zeroed in on the center platter of fried chicken, carefully selecting the largest, crispiest, most perfectly golden brown chicken leg from the pile. With a motherly fondness, she reserved exclusively for one person in the room. She dropped the choice piece of meat onto Trey's plate with a heavy, satisfying thud. She took a pristine white linen napkin and slowly wiped her fingers, refusing to look in my direction. She took a sip of her ice water, swallowed, and finally raised her eyes to meet mine. They were completely devoid of any maternal warmth, replaced entirely by the cold, assessing glare of a corporate board member dealing with an insubordinate employee. Sign the documents. Yeah, she said, her voice smooth, but carrying an undeniable edge of absolute authority. You have embarrassed this house and this family name quite enough. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the casual cruelty of her words. When you threw away that highly competitive, prestigious internship at Chase Bank 5 years ago, my mother continued, her tone dripping with disappointment. Your father and I were humiliated. We pulled every string we had to get you into that program. And what did you do? You abandoned a guaranteed 6F figure, starting salary to run around the city doing those nowhere jobs. You opened that little consulting office in a strip mall and started playing savior to people who will never amount to anything. We turned a blind eye to it. We let you have your little rebellion because we thought you would eventually grow out of it and come to your senses. But you are 30 years old. Now, you are not a child playing charity worker anymore. She pointed a manicured finger toward my brother, who was currently tearing into the chicken leg she had just served him, with a look of supreme satisfaction. Trey is the actual future of this family, my mother stated with absolute conviction. He is building a tangible empire. He is taking the Dubois legacy into the 21st century. And he needs that trust fund money to secure this resort deal. You do not need it to fund whatever it is you do all day. Stop being selfish and do what is right for your family. The betrayal stung even though I had expected it. They viewed my independence not as a triumph, but as a direct insult to their rigid, status-obsessed way of life. I slowly shifted my gaze to the head of the table. I looked at my father, Elias, the man who had taught me how to read complex financial statements when I was only 12 years old. He was the man who used to pat my head and call me his brilliant little executive before Trey was old enough to overshadow me. Now Elias was suddenly incredibly interested in the melting ice cubes swirling around in his expensive crystal bourbon glass. He turned his head slightly, deliberately staring at a painting on the far wall, actively avoiding my gaze. He refused to look at me. The silence radiating from him was a much heavier and far more devastating blow than my mother's harsh words. They had orchestrated this entire ambush together. They had discussed stripping me of my inheritance behind closed doors, weighing my worth against Trey's, and they had mutually agreed that I was entirely expendable. I slowly moved my hand off the damp legal documents. I looked directly at Harper. My sister-in-law was still wearing that sickeningly sweet, victorious smile. Her posture relaxed, utterly convinced that she was completely untouchable. She thought she had my parents wrapped so tightly around her finger that she could insult me in my own childhood home without facing a single consequence. I kept my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady, channeling every ounce of the ruthless corporate fixer I truly was into my tone. You talk a whole lot about the Elite Dubois brand, Harper, I said, watching her smile falter just a fraction of an inch. You talk about projecting an untouchable high society image to the political donors and the real estate board. That is an incredibly fascinating perspective coming directly from you. Tell me, does that elite, flawless image include your spectacular performance at First Church last Easter Sunday? Harper's fake smile vanished. Instantly, the color rapidly drained from her perfectly bronzed cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very fragile. Because I distinctly remember the details of that morning, I continued leaning forward slightly refusing to let her look away. I remember you showing up to the most important Sunday service of the year, 3 margaritas deep before noon, wearing a sundress so breathtakingly inappropriate that the head usher had to physically hand you a modesty shawl in the foyer. Trey stopped chewing. My mother gasped softly. I did not stop. I remember you loudly and aggressively arguing with the pastor's wife in the vestibule because she politely asked you to lower your voice while the youth choir was singing their solo. I remember you slurring your words, stumbling blindly into the communion table, and making a complete unmitigated spectacle of yourself in front of the exact same conservative city council members. Trey is currently begging for campaign donations. I tilted my head, studying her horrified expression. You want to sit here and talk to me about dragging down the family reputation? You want to lecture me about looking common? I asked, my voice slicing through the dining room like a scalpel. You are the talking definition of a public relations liability. You do not elevate this family, Harper. You just spend my grandfather's hard-earned money to buy the class and elegance you inherently lack. For one split second, the dining room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit through the vents. Then the room completely erupted. But the explosion of anger was not directed at Harper. It was entirely directed at me. Harper let out a loud theatrical gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as if she had just been physically struck on perfect quay. Her eyes welled up with massive heavy tears. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. She let out a broken, jagged sob that echoed off the high ceilings. And she immediately slumped against Trey's shoulder, burying her face deep into the lapel of his custom-tailored suit. I try so incredibly hard to be a good part of this family, Harper wailed, her voice muffled and shaking with manufactured devastation. I just wanted to help Trey build our future together. Why is she always so incredibly hateful to me? I have never done anything but try to support her little charities and be a good sister to her. It was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. It was the flawless weaponization of white female tears deployed in the center of a wealthy black household, and my entire family fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. My mother slammed both of her hands flat onto the dining table, rattling the silverware. Nia Dubois. She shrieked, her voice shrill with genuine fury. How dare you speak to your sister-in-law that way? She is trying to help secure the financial future of this family. You owe her a sincere apology right this exact second. My father finally looked up from his bourbon glass, his brow furrowed in deep, righteous anger. He pointed a stern finger at me from the head of the table. That was entirely uncalled for, Nia. We are having a serious business discussion about capital allocation, and you instantly resort to petty, vicious personal attacks against your brother's wife. You are acting exactly like a petulant, jealous child. Apologize to Harper immediately. I stared at them in absolute disbelief. They were actively ignoring the fact that Harper had just insulted my life's work, my community, and my entire existence less than 3 minutes ago. They were choosing to comfort the woman who had openly disrespected our culture simply because she had managed to squeeze out a few strategic tears. Trey did not ask for an apology. Trey exploded. He pushed his heavy leather dining chair back with such violent force that it tipped over backwards and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. He stood up abruptly. His chest, heaving his face, flushed dark red with absolute unrestrained rage. He pointed his finger directly at my face, leaning his entire body weight across the ruined Sunday dinner, knocking over a crystal salt shaker in the process. You are a bitter, jealous, pathetic failure, Trey screamed, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. His voice vibrated with absolute contempt, echoing loudly through the large estate. You sit there acting so high and mighty, pretending you have some sort of moral superiority, while you contribute absolutely nothing of value to this legacy. You resent Harper because she is actually building a real future with me while you play in the dirt with people who do not matter. I did not break eye contact. I let him scream, memorizing every single word he was saying, filing it away for the exact moment I would utterly destroy his life. You are a parasite. Natre continued spitting the words across the table. You drain our parents' patience. You embarrass this family with your poverty and your lack of ambition, and you stand directly in the way of real tangible financial progress. You do not belong at this dinner table. You do not belong anywhere near the family business. He raised his fist and slammed it down hard onto the stack of legal documents right next to the spreading puddle of spilled water, splashing droplets onto his expensive cuff. And you sure as hell do not deserve to carry the Dubois name. Trey roared, his voice cracking with pure malice. Sign the damn papers right now and get out of my house. The echo of Trey's vicious scream bounced off the high-vated ceilings of the dining room, hanging in the air like a thick, toxic fog, for 10 agonizing seconds. Absolutely no one moved. The entire family sat in a frozen collective anticipation. They were waiting for my spirit to finally snap. Harper subtly adjusted her posture, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, her eyes fixed entirely on my face. Hungrily searching for the first sign of a tear, my mother kept her gaze firmly glued to her plate, playing the role of the passive, innocent bystander, while actively allowing my execution. My father took another slow, cowardly sip of his bourbon, completely washing his hands of his only daughter. They expected me to reach out with a trembling hand. They expected me to pick up the expensive gold fountain pen resting beside the documents. They expected me to break down, to cry, to apologize for being a disappointment, and to sign away my entire financial future just to earn back a fraction of their conditional love. I looked down at the pen. I looked at the signature line on the relinquishment form. I took us a slow, deep breath, preparing to deliver the verbal equivalent of a nuclear strike to my brother's inflated ego. But before I could even part my lips to speak, a sharp, violent sound cracked through the dining room. It was the heavy, unmistakable thud of carved ebony wood striking the polished hardwood floor. The sound was so loud, so sudden, and so commanding that Harper physically jumped in her seat, clutching her chest. Trey snapped his head toward the far end of the long mahogany table. My parents both froze. Their eyes, widening in sudden gripping panic, sitting at the absolute head of the table, shrouded in the dim amber light of the chandelier, was my grandfather, Jeremiah Dubois. Pops. At 80 years old, Pops was a man who commanded ultimate, unquestionable respect. He was the sole architect of the Dubois empire, long before my parents were wearing designer suits and attending high society charity galas. Pops was a young black man working 3 grueling jobs. He started with a single laundromat in the very neighborhoods Harper had just degraded. He bought one neglected apartment building, fixed it with his own callous hands, and leveraged it to buy another. He built our generational wealth from the pavement, up surviving, redlining, aggressive banks, and a system designed to see him fail. He had sat in absolute silence for the entire dinner. He had quietly eaten his collard green beans and cornbread, watching his son, his daughter-in-law, and his arrogant grandson completely dismantle the foundation of family loyalty he had spent a lifetime building. They had ignored him. They had treated him like a fragile, invisible relic of the past. Assuming his advanced age meant he no longer possessed his legendary fire. They were catastrophically wrong. Pops gripped the head of his custom ebony walking stick with a slow, terrifying deliberation. He pushed himself up from his heavy velvet armchair. The scraping of his chair against the floor sounded like a warning siren. He stood at his pranas, full height, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. Dad. My father. Elias started his voice, suddenly pitching up with nervous, frantic energy. Dad. Please sit down. You should not be getting worked up. Trey and Nia are just having a little sibling disagreement. It is just business. Let us handle this. Pops did not even look at his son. He kept his furious, unyielding gaze locked entirely on Trey. A little sibling disagreement. Pops repeated. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, gravel, and thunder rolling through the dining room. It carried the weight of a man who had stared down ruthless corporate sharks and won. He slowly turned his head to look at my father. Elias, you sit at my table, eating the food my money paid for in a house my legacy built. And you allow your boy to speak to your daughter like she is an animal in the street. You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a father. My father shrank back into his chair, looking like a scolded child. My mother's face drained of alder, her hands shaking as she dropped her napkin into her lap. Pops turned his attention back to Trey. He took one slow, heavy step forward. The tap of his cane echoed again. You think you are a king. Trey Pops, said his voice, dropping to a dangerously quiet volume. You wear those expensive suits. And you sit in boardrooms playing with spreadsheets. And you actually believe you built this empire. You did not build a single thing. In your entire life, you inherited a kingdom, and you act like you conquered it. Trey's jaw tightened. He stood his ground, but I could see the subtle tremor in his hands. Grandpa, you do not understand the market right now, Trey argued, trying to mask his panic with corporate arrogance. Nia is an active liability to our brand. The investors want a clean, streamlined family front. She refuses to assimilate. She refuses to contribute to the fund. She does not deserve to benefit from the Dubois name, while she actively drags it through the mud. Pops let out a short, harsh laugh that held absolutely no humor. The Dubois name, Pops, said, tasting the words as if they were bitter. You talk about this name like it is a corporate trademark. You talk about it like it is a country club membership. This name was forged in the exact same neighborhoods You and your shallow, empty-headed wife just called slums. Harper gasped, her face flushing crimson, her fake tears drying up instantly as the spotlight of my grandfather's wrath hit her directly. Nia is the only person at this table who actually understands what the Dubois name means. Pops roared, his voice suddenly booming with terrifying power. She is the only one building up our people instead of stepping on their necks to climb a social ladder built by people who will never truly accept you. Pops lifted his ebony cane and pointed it straight at Trey's chest. The entire room stopped breathing. You say she does not deserve to carry the Dubois name. Pops growled, his eyes narrowing into dark, lethal slits. If my granddaughter does not deserve to carry this name, then she will be the only one to carry my name. And she will take over absolutely everything that comes with it. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. The words hung in the air, heavy and fatal. Harper's perfect, calculated mask completely disintegrated. Her jaw literally dropped open, her eyes darting frantically between Trey and Pops. My mother let out a small, strangled noise of pure horror. My father shot up from his chair, knocking his bourbon glass over the amber liquid spilling across the table. Dad, you cannot possibly mean that. Elias stammered, holding his hands up defensively. You cannot rewrite the trust. You cannot bypass Trey. The board will not allow it. The development deal will collapse. I own the board. Pops shouted back, slamming his cane down so hard I thought the floorboards would crack. I own the trust. I own the land you are trying to sell. And I own the very chair you are sitting in. I am revoking your authority, Elias. And I am cutting your greedy, arrogant son out of the succession plan completely. Nia is the sole heir. It is done. Trey's face morphed from arrogant superiority to absolute unhinged desperation. His entire carefully constructed reality was being ripped away from him in a matter of seconds. The golden child was being stripped of his crown. He looked at me sitting calmly in my chair, and then he looked at his grandfather. His breathing became erratic, his chest heaving as the narcissistic injury completely consumed his mind. He lost whatever tiny fraction of respect he had left. You are crazy, Trey screamed, his voice cracking, completely losing his mind. He violently slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward the 80-year-old patriarch. You are out of your mind. You are a shinile, delusional old man. And you have no idea what you are doing. Trey frantically dug his hand into his tailored suit pocket and ripped out his smartphone. His fingers were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device. He glared at my father, his eyes wild and manic. Dad, do not just stand there, Trey yelled, waving the phone in the air. I am calling the corporate lawyers right now. We are not letting this old fool destroy our future because he has a soft spot for this failure of a sister. We are calling an emergency board meeting. We will file an injunction. We will have him declared medically incompetent. We are stripping him of his asset control. First thing tomorrow morning. I sat back in my chair watching my brother declare open warfare on the man who had given him everything. The hook was set. The line was drawn. Trey thought he could outmaneuver the founder of the Dubois empire with a few legal threats. He thought this was just a simple boardroom takeover. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own financial death warrant, and I was going to be the one to execute it. The drive back to my penthouse that Sunday night was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call a friend to vent. I simply watched the city lights blur past the windows of my car, my mind constantly replaying the absolute panic in Trey's eyes when Pops stripped him of his power. I knew my brother intimately. I knew he would not take this public defeat lying down. A narcissist backed into a corner will always resort to the most destructive, underhanded tactics available. I just did not expect him to stoop to attempted murder. The next morning began like any other Monday. I woke up at 50 my luxury high-rise apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a massive, beautifully decorated space, paid for entirely in cash by my own consulting firm. A fact my family conveniently chose to ignore because it did not fit their narrative of my failure. I was standing in my pristine marble kitchen, holding a cup of black coffee and reviewing overseas market trends on my tablet when my personal phone rang. The caller ID displayed Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Dr. Sterling Pops, primary cardiologist. Sounded deeply uncomfortable when I answered the call. He was a brilliant surgeon, a man who rarely sounded rattled. But today, his voice was tight with severe bureaucratic anxiety. Mr. Dubois, he began hesitantly, clearing his throat. I am calling regarding Jeremiah's scheduled valve replacement surgery tomorrow morning. I am afraid we have hit a significant administrative roadblock. I asked him what he meant, assuming it was a minor insurance glitch or a scheduling conflict. The reality was a cold-blooded execution of power. Dr. Sterling explained that less than an hour ago, my father Elias and my brother Trey had marched directly into the hospital's legal department. Accompanied by two aggressive corporate attorneys, they had presented an emergency medical proxy and a temporary financial conservatorship order signed by a judge they likely bribed. They claimed that Pops was suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia. They argued that his sudden outburst at dinner the previous night was undeniable proof of his cognitive decline and erratic behavior. Using that fabricated legal leverage, they had frozen every single one of my grandfather's personal and medical accounts. The hospital cannot proceed with a high-risk elective procedure when the primary financial guarantor's accounts are locked and the legal medical proxies are actively withdrawing consent. Dr. Sterling explained, sounding genuinely apologetic and entirely overwhelmed. Your brother stated that Jeremiah is not of sound mind to undergo this procedure, and they are refusing to authorize the hospital expenses. My hands are tied by our legal department. My blood ran completely cold. Pops absolutely needed this surgery. His heart was failing, and delaying the procedure by even a few weeks could be fatal. Trey and my father knew this. They absolutely knew the physical risks. They were literally weaponizing Pop's health, holding his very life hostage just to force him to reverse his decision about the trust fund. They were willing to let the man who built our entire family legacy die on a technicality, just so Trey could secure the funding for his luxury real estate deal. Before I could even formulate a response to the doctor, my tablet began lighting up with a rapid, blinding succession of news alerts. My public relations monitoring software was going haywire. I put Dr. Sterling on a brief hold and tapped the screen. A prominent Chicago business journal and a popular high society gossip blog had just published simultaneous exclusive stories. The headline of the business journal read, Dubois Empire in Chaos, as Patriarch's Mental Decline Sparks Family Crisis. The gossip blog was much more vicious and direct. Rogue granddaughter accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation in Dubois trust fund scandal. I quickly skimmed the articles, my eyes absorbing the meticulously planted lies. The pieces were filled with inflammatory quotes from an anonymous source remarkably close to the family. It was obviously Harper. The quotes painted a tragic, horrifying picture of a manipulative, unemployed granddaughter preying on a senile old man. The anonymous source claimed I had isolated Pops, emotionally abused him, and coerced him into changing his financial directives in a desperate bid to fund my failing lifestyle. They even mentioned my community centers, framing them as fraudulent shell companies I used to siphon money from the Dubois estate to cover my massive personal debts. It was a textbook ruthless smear campaign. Trey and Harper were executing a highly coordinated strike. Cut off the money. threatened Pop's life, and destroy my reputation in the press, all at the exact same time. They wanted to isolate me completely from society. They wanted to make me look so toxic, so greedy, and so desperate that no reputable lawyer would take my case and no bank would lend me money to fight them. They truly believed that by lunchtime I would be standing on their doorstep crying hysterically, begging for forgiveness and signing the relinquishment forms just to save my grandfather's life and clear my name. A lesser person would have panicked. A normal person would have called a lawyer crying, terrified of the public humiliation and the medical crisis. I did not panic. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee cup against the wall in a fit of rage. I simply walked over to the floor, to ceiling window of my penthouse, and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. A slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. Trey had made a massive fatal miscalculation. He was playing a game of checkers, completely unaware that I owned the entire board. He thought he was dealing with the helpless, idealistic little sister who relied on the family allowance and begged for scraps of approval. He had absolutely no idea he had just picked a fight with the shadow CEO of Oakhaven Partners. I switched back to the call with Dr. Sterling. He was still waiting patiently on the line, likely expecting me to break down in tears and ask for a payment plan. Dr. Sterling, I said, my voice completely devoid of any panic or hesitation. Do not cancel the surgical team. Do not alter the operating room schedule. The surgery proceeds tomorrow at 8:00 inches the morning, exactly as planned. Miss Dubois, the doctor replied, sounding incredibly stressed. I understand you are upset, but the billing department cannot authorize a procedure of this magnitude without guaranteed funding. Your brother has completely frozen the accounts. The hospital requires a minimum deposit of $400. 000, just to hold the surgical suite and the specialized medical team. Without that, capital. My hands are legally tied, and the administration will cancel the booking. I understand completely. Doctor, I replied, my tone shifting into absolute authority. Please hold for one more moment. I did not disconnect the call. Instead, I walked down the hall into my private home office. It was a secured room my family had never seen. Equipped with Militera encrypted servers and multiple trading monitors displaying real-time global market data, I walked over to the biometric safe, hidden behind a framed painting on the wall. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open with a soft mechanical whir. Inside sat a pristine, untraceable satellite phone. I picked up the secondary phone and dialed a private internal number. It rang exactly once before being answered by Marcus, my chief financial officer at Oakhaven. Good morning. Nia Marcus, said his voice crisp and strictly professional. What do we need today? Marcus, I need an immediate expedited wire transfer. I instructed, my eyes tracking the scrolling financial data on the scrolling financial data. My screens. I need $500. 0 inches liquid cash, routed directly to the private billing department at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I am sending you the routing numbers right now through the secure server. I want the transfer executed from our offshore reserve accounts. Keep the donor name completely anonymous, listed only as a private medical endowment. Consider it done. Marcus replied without a single second of hesitation. The funds will be verified in their account within the next 4 minutes. Do you need anything else flagged for review before the morning meetings? No, I said, my smile widening into something genuinely dangerous. Just prepare the legal team. We are going hunting this week. I hung up the secure phone, locked it back inside the biometric safe, and returned to the line with Dr. Sterling. Doctor, I said smoothly, walking back out into the bright morning light of my living room. I highly suggest you refresh your billing department's ledger in about 3 minutes. You will find a direct cash wire transfer of $500,000 sitting in the account specifically earmarked for Jeremiah Dubois medical expenses that covers the surgical suite, your entire specialized team, and his premium recovery care for the next month, paid in full. No insurance companies, no family trust funds, and absolutely no input from my brother or my father. I could hear the absolute stunned silence on the other end of the line. The sound of rapid typing echoed through the phone as the doctor presumably messaged his internal billing system to check. A sharp gasp of disbelief told me the money had officially landed. Miss Dubois, the doctor stammered completely, losing his professional composure. The funds, they are already here. But your brother said you had no access to capital. He said you were financially destitute. My brother says a lot of things. Doctor, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that commanded absolute obedience. He is about to learn that he does not control the universe. Keep my grandfather safe. I will handle the rest. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the marble counter. Trey thought he could starve me out. He thought he could use my grandfather's failing heart as leverage to steal my birthright and fund his pathetic social climbing. I thought releasing a few nasty gossip articles would break my spirit. He had awoken a monster, and I was going to systematically dismantle his entire life. I spent the next 48 hours letting Trey and my father marinate in their false sense of victory. I knew they were aggressively checking the hospital billing system, trying to figure out how a seemingly bankrupt unemployed woman had instantly produced $500,000 in untraceable liquid cash. They were scrambling, but they were arrogant enough to believe my sudden influx of funds was a fluke, a desperate loan from a foolish friend, or a final unauthorized drain on one of Pop's old accounts. They decided to push forward with their agenda, completely blind to the trap closing around them. The battlefield shifted on Wednesday evening to the sprawling manicured grounds of the Oak Brook Country Club. It was the night of the Heritage Excellence Gala, an annual highly exclusive fundraising event that served as the absolute epicenter of Black high society in Chicago. Generational wealth, political power, and corporate dominance all collided in one grand ballroom. For Trey, this night was critical. He needed to secure the final pledges from the real estate board and several key city council members to launch his luxury resort development and his upcoming political campaign. I arrived precisely an hour after the doors opened. I stepped out of my hired car wearing a custom-tailored floor-length emerald green silk gown. The fabric was sleek, aggressive, and completely unforgiving, flowing around me like liquid glass. I paired it with vintage diamond drop earrings that I had purchased myself at an auction in Geneva. I looked exactly like the billionaire power broker I was. But to the people inside that building, heavily influenced by Trey's vicious media smear campaign, I was a rug, desperate daughter clinging to the fringes of relevance. The moment I stepped past the velvet ropes and into the grand ballroom, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I could instantly feel the heavy judgmental weight of 100 pairs of eyes locking onto me. The jazz band playing softly in the corner was nearly drowned out by the sudden sweeping wave of harsh whispers. Trey and Harper had done their malicious work perfectly. The planted articles accusing me of elder abuse and financial manipulation had circulated through every group chat and inbox in this room. I kept my spine perfectly straight and my chin elevated. I did not shrink away from their stares. I walked directly into the center of the ballroom, carrying myself with the untouchable grace of a woman who held the executioner's switch, which it did not take me long to spot my target. Harper was holding court near the massive crystal champagne fountain. She was strategically positioned in the center of a tight circle of the city's most powerful, wealthy Black matriarchs. These were the women who controlled the philanthropic boards, the women whose husbands owned the banks and the zoning committees. Harper was wearing a pale blush gown, looking incredibly fragile and delicate, playing the role of the exhausted, deeply concerned daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. I slowly walked toward the group close enough to hear her, without being immediately noticed. Harper was delicately pressing a lace handkerchief to the corner of her eye, weaponizing her white fragility in a room full of people her ancestors would not have even allowed through the front door a generation ago. It has just been an absolute nightmare for Trey, Harper was saying, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. We are just so heartbroken watching Jeremiah lose his mental faculties. Dementia is such a cruel disease. But the hardest part is watching family take advantage of a sick, confused old man. Trey is trying everything to protect the family estate. But Nia is just draining the accounts, dry to fund her lifestyle. It is a tragedy. It truly is. A collective murmur of sympathetic disapproval rippled through the circle of wealthy women. They were shaking their heads. Eating out of the palm of her hand, I did not wait another second. I stepped directly into the circle, placing myself right in front of Harper. Good evening, ladies, I said, my voice rich, warm, and carrying effortlessly over the music. I hope you are all enjoying the gala. The circle went completely silent. The matriarchs looked uncomfortable, shifting, their weight caught in the middle of a high society scandal. Harper's face went rigid. Her eyes widened in genuine panic as she looked at me. She had firmly believed that the sheer force of the public humiliation and the gossip articles would have kept me hiding in my apartment. The sight of me standing there wearing a dress that cost more than her husband's car radiating absolute power short-circuited her brain. She hated that I was not defeated. She hated that I was not broken. Harper's eyes darted frantically around the room. Realizing she was losing control of the narrative, she needed to put me back in my place. She needed to assert her dominance and humiliate me so thoroughly that I would be forced to flee the event in shame. She was holding a full, brimming crystal flute of vintage champagne in her right hand. She took a tiny step forward, pretending to turn toward one of the older women in the circle. With a calculated, incredibly deliberate clumsiness, she shifted her weight and violently jerked her wrist backward. The entire glass of freezing cold, sticky champagne flew through the air and splashed directly across the bodice of my emerald silk gown. The liquid hit my chest with a shocking chill, soaking instantly into the delicate, unforgiving fabric. A massive dark stain immediately began to spread across the front of the dress, ruining the expensive silk in seconds. The crystal glass slipped from Harper's hand and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces on the marble floor. Several women in the circle let out loud, shocked gasps, jumping backward to avoid the splashing liquid. "Oh my goodness," Harper shrieked, her voice pitched unnaturally loud to ensure that every single person within a 50-foot radius turned to look at us. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth in a display of exaggerated theatrical horror. "Yeah. I am so incredibly sorry. I just lost my footing." I stood completely motionless. I did not gasp. I did not look down at the ruined silk clinging to my skin. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Harper's face. Beneath her mask of fake shock, I could see the malicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes. She leaned in closer to me, lowering her voice just enough so that only the circle of women around us could hear her next words. "I am so sorry." Nia Harper sneered, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. "I completely forgot that you are unemployed right now. I know things are incredibly tight with your little strip mall business failing. I sincerely hope you did not have to rent that dress for tonight, because you certainly do not have the money to replace it." The cruelty of her words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She was banking on my pride breaking. She wanted me to run away crying. She wanted to prove to the entire room that I was the poor, pathetic outcast of the Dubois family. Before I could even formulate a response, two figures pushed frantically through the gathering crowd. It was my parents. Elias and Lorraine rushed into the circle, their faces flushed with panic at the sight of a public scene. They took one look at the shattered glass on the floor, the spreading dark stain on my chest, and Harper standing there with her hands covering her mouth. The reaction of my parents was the final devastating nail in the coffin of our family relationship. My mother did not rush to my side. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not offer me a napkin or her wrap to cover my ruined freezing dress. Instead, Lorraine bypassed me entirely. She grabbed Harper's hands, inspecting them frantically. "Harper, sweetie, are you all right?" Lorraine fussed, her voice thick with maternal concern for the woman who had just assaulted her actual daughter. "Did the glass cut you? Come here. Let us get you away from this mess before you ruin your shoes." My father turned on me, his face twisted in a scowl of deep embarrassment. He lowered his voice into a harsh, angry hiss, stepping close to my face so the donors would not hear his exact words. But his aggressive posture was visible to everyone. "Yeah, look at what you have done." Elias scolded me, his eyes full of pure contempt. "You cannot even be in the same room as your sister-in-law without causing a disruptive, humiliating scene. You are upsetting Harper in front of the most important board members in the city. You need to leave right now. Go home and stop embarrassing this family." My father then turned his back on me. He faced the wealthy matriarchs, putting on his smoothest corporate smile. Bowing his head slightly, I apologize profusely for my daughter's erratic behavior. "Ladies," he said smoothly, "it has been a very stressful week for her, and she is clearly not in her right mind. Please excuse the disruption." I stood in the center of the country club ballroom, freezing champagne, soaking through my dress, publicly discarded by the very people who brought me into this world. My mother was actively comforting my attacker. My father was actively apologizing to the public for my existence. They had just chosen their side definitively and permanently. They had chosen the illusion of power over their own flesh and blood. I looked at my mother, wiping imaginary tears from Harper's eyes. I looked at my father, desperately trying to smooth over the social ripples. The camera in my mind pushed in slowly on my own face. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not run toward the exit. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed the moral justification to absolutely annihilate everything these people held dear. They thought this was the end of the embarrassment. They thought they had successfully chased me out of their elite circle. They were about to discover that the night had not even begun. My father stood with his arm extended toward the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom, his face a mask of rigid, unforgiving authority. He was giving me a direct order to flee fully, expecting the weight of his disapproval and the collective judgment of Chicago's black elite to crush my spirit. He expected me to hang my head, turn around, and disappear into the humid night air, validating every single, a malicious rumor they had planted about me in the press. I did not move a single muscle toward the exit. The jazz band in the corner had stopped playing. The low hum of overlapping conversations had completely flatlined. The wealthy matriarchs, the city council members, and the corporate executives were all watching with bated breath, eager to see the disgraced Dubois daughter finally break. My mother was still hovering over Harper, making a grand show of inspecting her pristine, completely dry hands for imaginary cuts. From the shattered glass on the floor, a passing waiter had rushed over with a tray, hastily handing Harper a fresh crystal flute of sparkling water to calm her manufactured nerves. She took it, her fingers delicately grasping the stem. Preparing to bask in her ultimate social victory, I slowly opened my vintage clutch. I reached inside and retrieved a small monogrammed silk handkerchief. I took one deliberate step forward, completely bypassing my father's outstretched arm. I ignored my mother entirely. I closed the physical distance between Harper and myself until we were sharing the exact same breathing space. My parents instinctively tried to step between us, but the sheer radiating authority in my posture froze them instantly in their tracks. I was no longer playing the role of the outcast sister. I was operating in my true element. I raised the silk handkerchief and gently, methodically began to dab at the freezing champagne soaking into my emerald gown. I kept my eyes locked onto Harper's face. The malicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes began to falter, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. She did not understand why I was not crying. She did not understand why I was not running away. I leaned in closer, my face just inches from hers. The scent of her heavy, expensive floral perfume mixed with the sharp tang of the spilled alcohol. I lowered my voice into a perfectly calibrated icy whisper, ensuring that my words would only reach her ears, shielding the exact details of her impending destruction from the surrounding crowd. This dress costs 12 yuan. Ling ling ling. I whispered, my tone smooth and razor sharp. It is a minor inconvenience, but it is absolutely nothing compared to the massive financial crater you are about to fall into. Harper's breath hitched. She tried to lean back, but I stepped closer, trapping her in my orbit. I know exactly how you and Trey have been funding your new elevated high society lifestyle. I continued softly, my eyes tracking the sudden erratic pulse beating frantically at the base of her neck. I know about the offshore Swift reserve account. I know about the shadow corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. And I know that Trey illegally diverted $3 million of investor capital from the Dubois Family Commercial Fund to purchase that 90-feet luxury yacht for your birthday last month. Harper's face drained of all color. The delicate blush painted on her cheeks looked suddenly stark and unnatural against her sickly pale skin. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. You see, Harper, I whispered, smiling pleasantly, for the benefit of the watching audience. While you were busy planting cheap gossip articles about me in local tabloids, I was busy making a phone call to the Internal Revenue Service. That specific offshore account is currently in the active crosshairs of the Federal Criminal Investigation Division. They have the routing numbers. They have the wire transfer signatures. They have the yacht registration documents. I tilted my head, watching the absolute unadulterated terror shatter her carefully constructed facade. So tell me, sweetie, I asked, my voice laced with lethal sweetness. When the federal agents freeze your bank accounts and raid your penthouse, who do you think is going to be forced to wear a prison jumpsuit first? The rogue unemployed granddaughter you despise, or the greedy wife holding the primary title to a maritime vessel purchased with stolen corporate funds? Harper let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, filling with genuine hyperventilating panic. The reality of federal tax evasion and corporate embezzlement crashed down on her all at once. She tried to take a step backward to get away from me, but her knees visibly buckled. Her hands began to shake with such violent tremors that she completely lost her grip on reality and her beverage. The fresh crystal flute slipped directly through her fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud ringing crash, shattering into jagged shards and splashing icy water across the hem of her own expensive blush gown. Harper did not even notice the mess. She stared at me as if I had just transformed into the devil himself. She clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. "What is going on here?" The booming, aggressive voice of my brother cut through the tense silence of the ballroom. Trey aggressively pushed his way through the circle of wealthy matriarchs, his face flushed with anger, his jaw set in a tight, furious line. He had been across the room, smoozing with the real estate board, but the sound of the second shattered glass had drawn his immediate attention. He stormed into the center of our circle, taking one look at Harper's pale, trembling form and my calm, composed posture. He immediately threw a protective arm around his wife, pulling her close to his side. "What did you just do to her?" Trey demanded, pointing a rigid finger directly at my face. He turned to my parents, who are standing frozen in shock. "I thought I told you to get her out of this building. I will call security right now and have her physically dragged out into the parking lot." Harper grabbed the lapel of Trey's suit jacket, her knuckles turning white. "Trey," she wheezed, her voice a terrified, breathless whisper. "Trey." The offshore account. The boat she knows. Trey's entire body went rigid. The aggressive, domineering anger vanished from his face in a fraction of a second, replaced by the exact same sickening power that had just overtaken his wife. He looked at me, his eyes wide and searching silently, begging for confirmation that he had misheard her. I offered him a bright, exceptionally polite smile, gently adjusting the strap of my vintage clutch. Before Trey could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, a sharp, intrusive sound pierced the air. It was his personal cell phone ringing from inside his tailored breast pocket. It was a specific high-priority ringtone he only used for the lead financial counsel of the Dubois Family Trust. Trey hesitated. He looked at me, then down at his phone. The device kept buzzing insistently, a demanding vibration that echoed the sudden spiraling panic in his chest. With shaking fingers, he pulled the phone out and pressed it to his ear, never taking his eyes off my face. "What is it?" Trey snapped into the receiver, trying desperately to maintain his commanding alpha male persona in front of the surrounding crowd. "We are in the middle of the fundraising gala. This better be an emergency." I watched the exact moment his entire world collapsed. I watched his shoulders slump. I watched his mouth fall open. I watched the arrogant, untouchable golden child of the Dubois family realize that he had just stepped into a bear trap. "What do you mean the debt was purchased?" Trey stammered, his voice cracking completely. Forgetting his audience, he took a stumbling step backward, releasing his grip on Harper. "No, that is impossible. We structured that loan internally. The bank cannot just sell the mortgage without notifying me." The voice on the other end of the line was frantic, buzzing loudly enough for me to hear the panicked cadence. Though the exact words were muffled, Trey began pacing in a small, tight circle, rubbing his free hand over his face. "You listen to me," he yelled into the phone, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "That specific portfolio contains the historical properties. That is the original laundromat. That is Pop's first apartment building. That is the absolute foundation of the Dubois family legacy. If we lose that collateral, the entire luxury resort deal is dead in the water." "Who bought the debt?" He stopped pacing. He listened to the answer. His phone slowly dropped from his ear, hanging limply at his side. He looked at my mother, who was staring at him in total confusion. He looked at my father, who was suddenly stepping forward, demanding to know what was happening to the family trust. Finally, Trey looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with a mixture of absolute dread and creeping, horrifying realization. I had leveraged the heart and soul of my grandfather's historical legacy to secure the funding for his gentrification project. He had put the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors up as collateral, assuming he could control the bank just like he controlled our parents. An anonymous corporate holding firm just bought the entirety of our outstanding debt. Trey whispered, his voice shaking so badly it barely carried across the circle. They bought the mortgage on the historical properties. They hold the deed. They can foreclose on our entire legacy tomorrow morning. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of pure victory. I turned on my heel, the ruined silk of my emerald dress flowing behind me, and walked gracefully toward the exit, leaving my family drowning in the wreckage of their own greed. Less than 4 hours after the hospital wire transfer cleared, the heavy mahogany double doors of my penthouse did not just open. They were violently thrown wide. The loud crash of the wood striking the entryway wall echoed through my pristine minimalist living room. I did not flinch. I did not stand up. I simply remained seated on my white leather sofa, slowly swirling the dark roast coffee in my mug, waiting for the circus to enter my home. Trey marched into my apartment like a man possessed. His normally flawless designer suit was completely rumpled. His tie loosened, and his face flushed with a desperate manic shade of crimson. Right behind him was my father, wearing an expression of manufactured, deeply fake parental concern. But what truly set the scene were the 2 uniformed Chicago police officers trailing awkwardly behind them, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. "Where are the papers?" Trey barked, his voice echoing sharply against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "Where is the fraudulent power of attorney you forced him to sign?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I placed the mug onto a custom marble coaster, taking my absolute time, refusing to validate his frantic energy. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said smoothly, directing my gaze entirely to the 2 police officers. "Can I offer you a bottle of water and espresso? You look a bit overheated." "Miss Dubois," the older of the 2 officers said, stepping forward with a hesitant, distinctly uncomfortable posture. He glanced around my immaculate multi-million-dollar penthouse, clearly realizing that this did not look like the scene of a crime. "We received an emergency call from your father and your brother. They have filed a formal report claiming severe elder financial abuse, psychological coercion, and fraud," they stated. "You are holding your grandfather's legal documents hostage during a mental health crisis." My father stepped around Trey, placing his hand over his heart in a sickening display of theatrical grief. "Yeah, sweetheart, it is over," Elias said, his voice dripping with a sickly, patronizing sympathy. "You are unwell. We know you are having a severe psychological episode. You illegally wired $500,000 to Northwestern Hospital this morning, using God knows what stolen funds. You have completely lost your grip on reality, and you are endangering your grandfather's life. We are here to get you the psychiatric help you so desperately need." I looked at the man who had helped raise me. He was actively standing in my living room, backed by armed police officers, threatening to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward just to regain control of a bank account. It was a level of moral bankruptcy so profound it was almost impressive. Trey could not contain his seething impatience. He stepped closer to me, his chest heaving. "We brought the police to execute an involuntary psychiatric hold," he sneered, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to hand over the medical proxy and the estate documents right now. The paramedics are waiting downstairs in the lobby. You are going to be escorted out of this building in a straitjacket if you do not comply." I leaned back into the soft leather of my sofa, crossing my legs elegantly. "Is that the master, Trey?" I asked, my voice carrying a lethal, unwavering calm. You lock your sister in a psych ward and then what? What happens to Pops? Trey let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, completely emboldened by the presence of the police. He actually believed he had already won. He believed I was cornered. Pops is going exactly where he belongs, Trey stated, his eyes wide and manic with greed. We have a highly secure, locked memory care facility in upstate New York, ready to receive him by tomorrow night. He is senile. He is completely incompetent. And once a state judge declares him medically unfit, his ridiculous little stunt from Sunday night is legally void. The temporary power of attorney reverts directly back to me and Dad. And then what I pressed, keeping my tone lightly conversational, coaxing him to dig his own grave in front of the officers. What happens to the estate? We liquidate the dead weight, Trey snapped proudly. Completely incapable of keeping his mouth shut, Horizon Developers is offering $60 million in pure cash for those slums in the historical district. Do you understand what that means? They are going to bulldoze those pathetic, decaying apartment buildings in that ancient laundromat, and they are going to build a premier complex of luxury condominiums. It is the deal of a lifetime. It secures my political donors. It secures Harper's lifestyle, and it elevates the Dubois name to the billionaire class. I am not letting you and a brain-deaded old man stand in the way of progress. The two police officers shifted uncomfortably on their feet. Even they could hear the absolute unhinged malice in my brother's voice. He was openly admitting his plan to institutionalize his grandfather just to demolish a historic black neighborhood for personal profit. I let a moment of total silence stretch across the room. I wanted Trey to feel the weight of his own words. I wanted him to bask in his perceived victory for just a few seconds longer. I slowly stood up. I smoothed the imaginary wrinkles from my tailored trousers. You are incredibly ambitious, Trey, I said softly. And, Dad, your dedication to mental health advocacy is truly inspiring. I turned to the two officers, offering them a polite, entirely unbothered smile. Officers, you are more than welcome to search my apartment. You can look for whatever fabricated documents my family claims I possess. But before you begin tossing my furniture, I highly suggest you wait exactly 15 seconds. Trey scoffed loudly. What are you talking about, are you? Stalling officers arrest her. She is resisting a medical hold. The distinct melodic chime of my private secure elevator interrupted his shouting. The heavy steel doors of the elevator parted smoothly, revealing three people. The first was a tall, incredibly sharp-looking woman in her late 40s, wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. This was Victoria Sterling, the absolute most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigator in the city of Chicago, and my personal lead counsel. Flanking her on either side were two massive, highly trained private security contractors from Oak Haven, my consulting firm. Victoria stepped into my living room with the terrifying grace of a great white shark entering a wading pool. She completely ignored Trey and Elias, walking directly toward the two police officers. Good afternoon, gentlemen, Victoria said, her voice commanding immediate absolute respect. My name is Victoria Sterling. I am the lead legal counsel for Miss Nia Dubois and the primary legal representative for the estate of Mr. Prime, Jeremiah Dubois. She snapped her briefcase open, pulling out a thick stack of crisp, legally stamped documents. She handed the first set directly to the older police officer. What you are currently doing, Victoria stated, her tone sharp and precise, is facilitating criminal trespassing and participating in a deeply illegal, fraudulent harassment campaign. Trey's face went completely blank. What, he stammered, taking a step back. No. We have a temporary conservatorship order. We filed it this morning. Victoria slowly turned her head to look at my brother, her eyes narrowing with professional disgust. Your temporary ex parte conservatorship order was officially vacated and thrown out by a federal judge exactly 42 minutes ago, she informed him coldly. She tapped the paper in the police officer's hand. As you can clearly see right there on page 3, Mr. Jeremiah Dubois underwent a comprehensive 4-hour cognitive evaluation yesterday afternoon, administered by 3 independent board-certified neurologists. He scored in the 99th percentile for mental acuity. He is of sound mind, perfect clarity, and absolute legal competence. My father swallowed hard, his hands dropping to his sides. His face was a portrait of impending doom. But the money Elias choked out. The $500,000 she stole to pay the hospital. Miss Dubois did not steal a single dime. Victoria corrected smoothly, handing the second document to the police officers. That transfer was executed from her own private corporate reserve. A corporation, I might add, that generates more net revenue in a single financial quarter than the entire Dubois family trust does in 5 years. Miss Dubois is the sole legally verified medical and financial proxy for her grandfather by his own completely competent choice. Victoria then reached into her briefcase one final time. She pulled out 2 brightly colored, highly visible legal folders. She walked right up to Trey and shoved the first folder aggressively against his chest. He reflexively grabbed it. She handed the second one to my father. Furthermore, Victoria announced, her voice echoing with total finality. You have both just been officially served. These are permanent, court-ordered, emergency restraining orders. You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Miss Nia Dubois, Mr. Jeremiah Dubois, or Northwestern Memorial Hospital. If you attempt to contact the surgical team, if you attempt to access the historical properties, or if you step foot in this penthouse again, you will be immediately arrested and jailed without bail. The police officers immediately stepped away from my family. The dynamic in the room flipped instantly. They were no longer here to help Trey. They suddenly realized they had been manipulated into participating in a fraudulent civil dispute by 2 desperate wealthy men. Sir, the older officer said, putting a firm, heavy hand on Trey's shoulder. You and your father need to exit the premises immediately. You have been served. You are trespassing. Trey looked down at the restraining order in his hands. His chest was heaving. He looked at the police officers, then at the private security contractors, and finally his panicked, furious eyes locked onto mine. The realization hit him like a freight train. There was no nursing home. There was no luxury condo development. There was no political campaign. I had anticipated every single one of his moves and completely neutralized him before he even walked through my door. You cannot do this, Trey screamed, trying to lunge forward. But the police officer immediately yanked him back, gripping his arm tightly. You are nothing. You are a nobody. I walked slowly toward him, stopping just out of his reach. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice barely a whisper, yet loud enough to echo in his nightmares. I am the CEO of Oakhaven Partners, I said, watching his face completely shatter as he recognized the name of the anonymous holding firm that had just bought all of his debt. And you, T, are officially evicted. The 2 police officers did not hesitate. The sudden introduction of federal legal threats, combined with the terrifyingly composed presence of Victoria Sterling, had completely shattered the illusion of my father and brother being concerned family members. They were now trespassing liabilities. The older officer grabbed Trey by the bicep, physically spinning him toward the entryway. Trey stumbled his expensive leather shoes, slipping awkwardly on the pristine marble floor. He tried to rip his arm away, But the second officer immediately stepped in. Placing a firm hand on his opposite shoulder, Elias stood absolutely paralyzed. The man who had spent my entire life dictating the terms of my existence, who had banished me from family dinners and publicly apologized for my behavior just a few nights prior, was now watching his golden child being manhandled out of my home. My father looked at me, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to formulate a command. But the sheer weight of his complete powerlessness suffocated the words in his throat. Victoria simply pointed toward the door, her expression colder than ice. "Get your hands off me," Trey shouted, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate pitch as the officer's frog marched him into the private elevator corridor. "I am Trey Dubois. I run this city. You cannot do this to me." The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, cutting off his frantic screaming. The profound silence that followed was absolute perfection. Victoria turned to me, offering a sharp, completely professional nod. "The temporary conservatorship has been permanently blocked," she stated, adjusting her briefcase. "They cannot touch Jeremiah legally, medically, or financially. I have a team of private investigators monitoring their movements, and the hospital's security has been provided with their photographs. If they even drive past Northwestern Memorial, they will be in handcuffs before they can shift their car into park." "Thank you, Victoria," I said, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude for the woman who had helped me build my empire from the shadows. "I will handle the rest from here." Victoria and the security contractors took the secondary elevator down to the lobby, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling, quiet expanse of my penthouse. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I had neutralized their immediate threat. I had saved Pops from a horrifying fate in a locked psychiatric ward. I had severed their access to his medical care and ripped the historic properties right out of their greedy hands. But the puzzle was still missing a massive, glaring piece. Trey was arrogant, selfish, and deeply entitled, but he was not suicidal. To openly forge a medical proxy, to bribe a judge for an emergency conservatorship, to risk federal prison, just to liquidate our grandfather's foundational real estate portfolio. It was incredibly sloppy. It reeked of absolute blind panic. A man only moves with that kind of reckless, destructive speed when he is running out of time. I needed to know exactly what was chasing him. I walked past the white leather sofa down the long, arched hallway and stepped into my private office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner hidden beneath the edge of my mahogany desk. The wall panel slid back, revealing my secure server room. The ambient temperature immediately dropped the cool air necessary to keep the massive Militera data towers from overheating. 3 large curved monitors flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a stark blue glow. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair and cracked my knuckles. It was time to completely dissect the golden child. I pulled up the proprietary financial tracking software my firm used for hostile corporate takeovers, because Oak Haven Partners had officially purchased the debt on the Dubois family historic properties. I now possess the legal authorization and the clear routing numbers required to access the internal ledgers of the Dubois Commercial Trust. This was the exact fund my father had handed over to Trey 5 years ago, bypassing me entirely. Because, as Elias had so bluntly put it, commercial real estate requires a masculine presence to command respect in the boardroom. I bypassed the superficial public F-facing accounts Trey used for his daily operations. I did not care about the operational budgets or the payroll ledgers. I ran a deep algorithmic trace on the primary capital reserves, searching for shell companies, offshore wire transfers, and unauthorized liquidations. Lines of encrypted code scrolled rapidly down the center screen. The software was aggressively peeling back the layers of digital obfuscation Trey had poorly constructed. He had clearly hired an expensive accountant to hide his tracks. But they were dealing with standard corporate audits. Not a shadow. CEO armed with Wall Street tracking algorithms. 10 minutes later, the firewall cracked. The true, unfiltered balance sheets of the Dubois Family Trust populated across all three of my monitors. I stared at the numbers in absolute sickening horror. The core family trust was completely empty. It was not just poorly managed. It was not just suffering from a bad fiscal quarter. It had been systematically aggressively bled entirely dry. I watched the red deficit numbers flashing on the screen. Tracking the massive crater Trey had dug right in the center of our family legacy, he had accumulated a staggering deficit of $5 million. My hands flew across the blank keyboard, frantically pulling up the transaction histories to see exactly where the money had gone. I expected to see failed real estate investments, poor stock market gambles, or bad corporate loans. Instead, the screen filled with a horrifying injury. Pathetic sequence of wire transfers to offshore accounts in Macau, Monaco, and private server banks in Las Vegas. Trey was not just a bad businessman. He was a degenerate, high-stakes gambler. The transactions painted a vivid, tragic picture of his addiction. He had been chasing his losses for years, siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time to cover underground syndicate debts. When he lost the liquid cash, he started leveraging the family properties, taking out illegal high-interest shadow mortgages against buildings Pops had owned outright since the 1970s. But the gambling was only half of the disease. I pulled up the secondary account ledgers, tracking a massive, sustained hemorrhage of capital that led directly to Harper, while my brother was burning millions at the baccarat tables. His wife was treating the Dubois Family Trust like her own personal, limitless credit card. I watched in disgust as the itemized expenses loaded onto the screen. 200美元. 000, wired to a Swiss medical spa for a month-long retreat. 50美元. 000, a month on private jet charters just to fly her friends to New York for weekend shopping trips. Endless rapid-fire transactions at Cartier Chanel and private diamond brokers in Antwerp. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. Harper had stood in the center of the country club ballroom just hours ago wearing a dress bought with stolen money and publicly mocked me for being unemployed. She had weaponized her fake, delicate victimhood, crying to the matriarchs about how hard it was to watch Pops lose his mind. All while she was literally wearing the proceeds of his stolen legacy around her neck. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces of the puzzle violently locking into place. The Dubois Commercial Trust was scheduled for a mandatory independent third-party audit at the end of the month. It was a standard procedure required by the city zoning board for any firm seeking the massive tax subsidies Trey wanted for his luxury condominium project. The second those auditors looked at the actual books, Trey's entire life would be over. The embezzlement, the wire fraud, the illegal leveraging of assets. It would all be exposed. He would be looking at decades in federal prison. And Harper would be stripped of every single luxury she possessed. Trey did not just want to build luxury condos to elevate his political career. He absolutely needed the $60 million cash payout from the sale of the historic neighborhood to quietly replace the $5 million he had stolen, pay off the remaining syndicate debts, and pocket the rest to maintain his illusion of wealth before the auditors arrived. But Pops had been the roadblock. Jeremiah Dubois loved that neighborhood. He had built his first laundromat there. He had bought his first apartment building there to ensure Black families had a safe, affordable place to live when the banks refused to give them mortgages. Pops would have never ever authorized the demolition of his life's work just to build sterile glass towers for the ultra-rich. So Trey and Elias had decided to simply eliminate him. They had fabricated the story about his dementia. They had provoked him at the Sunday dinner to document an outburst. They had bribed a judge and forged a medical proxy. All with the explicit, horrifying intention of locking the man who built their entire universe into a psychiatric facility. They were perfectly willing to let his heart fail to deny him life-saving surgery and to let him rot in a locked ward. All to cover up a gambling debt and a shopping addiction. They were not just greedy. They were absolute monsters. I reached out and hit the print command. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the room. Word to life. Churning out page after page of undeniable physical evidence. I watched the stack of papers grow, containing every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every desperate, pathetic attempt Trey had made to hide his crimes. I picked up my secure satellite phone. I did not dial my lawyer. I did not dial the police. I dialed a direct encrypted number that connected to the senior investigative reporter at the most prominent, ruthless financial newspaper in the country. The phone rang twice before a sharp, impatient voice answered. "I have a story for you," I said, my voice carrying the absolute chilling authority of an executioner, delivering a final sentence. And I have the exact paper trail to prove it. The Dubois family empire is entirely bankrupt. And the golden child is a fraud. Check your secure inbox in exactly 2 minutes. The morning air was thick with the humid weight of a Chicago summer. But the true suffocating pressure came from the circus erected in the middle of the historic South Side district. Trey was a cornered animal. And a narcissist backed into a corner does not retreat. They double down blindly, despite knowing that Oakhaven Partners held his debt despite the impending financial audit. My brother chose the most spectacularly arrogant path available. He genuinely believed he could outrun his own ruin. He operated on the delusion that if he could execute the sale of the properties publicly flanked by local politicians and blinding camera flashes, he could force the transaction through secure the $60 million payout and bury his embezzlement forever before my reporter contact published the story. 9:01, Friday morning. Trey had transformed the street directly in front of Pop's original brick apartment building into a massive, heavily polished public relations event. I watched the live broadcast feed from the secure monitors in my office, tracking his every move before making my own. Trey had spared no expense for his grand finale. A towering stage draped in patriotic bunting had been erected over the cracked pavement. A massive vinyl banner reading, "A new Dubois legacy" hung across the facade of Parend, the very laundromat my grandfather had built with his bare hands. Dozens of folding chairs were filled with city council members, real estate moguls, and wealthy donors. Behind the steel police barricades, the actual residents of the neighborhood stood watching in anxious silence, completely aware that their homes and their community were being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Trey stood at the central podium, looking like the perfect visionary young executive. He wore a sharp navy suit, his posture exuding absolute confidence, projecting the illusion of a man who had everything under control. But what truly turned my stomach was the sight of my mother. Lorraine stood directly to Trey's right. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit. Her hair immaculately styled her face, radiating absolute sickening pride. She clapped her hands together, enthusiastically beaming at the crowd. She was actively celebrating the destruction of her father-in-law's life work. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with the son who had stolen millions from their family trust, completely indifferent to the trail of deceit and fraud he had left in his wake. As long as Trey maintained the illusion of high society prestige, she was willing to applaud him while he sold our heritage for scrap. My father, Elias, stood on Trey's left, heartily shaking hands with the mayor of Chicago, playing the role of the dignified patriarch passing the torch. "Thank you all for being here today," Trey announced into the microphone, his voice echoing loudly across the historic block. His tone was smooth, practiced, and dripping with false humility. Today marks a turning point for this city. For too long, this neighborhood has been left behind, trapped in the past, decaying into a slum that no longer reflects the greatness of Chicago. I watched the screen, my jaw clenching as he blatantly disrespected the safe haven Pops had built for Black families who had nowhere else to go. It is time for revitalization. Trey continued gesturing broadly to the properties behind him. It is time to replace these outdated, crumbling structures with the premier luxury living spaces this district deserves. We are bringing progress. But progress requires difficult decisions, and it requires capable, clear-minded leadership. Trey paused, lowering his head, perfectly mimicking the sorrowful expression Harper had utilized at the country club. "It is with a very heavy heart that my father and I must address the rumors regarding the Dubois family leadership," Trey said, his voice dropping an octave for dramatic effect. "As many of you know, my grandfather, Jeremiah Dubois, is suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline. It is a tragedy to watch a great man lose his mental faculties. Unfortunately, certain unstable rogue elements within our own family have attempted to exploit his illness, manipulating his confusion to halt this essential development and drag the Dubois name through the mud." My mother nodded solemnly beside him, pressing a hand to her chest in fake sympathy. "That stops today," Trey declared, his voice rising with triumphant authority. "Early this morning, my father and I officially filed an emergency petition with the state Supreme Court to strip all previous medical and financial proxies. We are assuming permanent full legal conservatorship over my grandfather and his estate. We are officially erasing the destructive, erratic individuals who have tried to sabotage this family. The Dubois legacy is secure and it moves forward with me." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. The sycophants and the paid developers cheered loudly, thrilled by the promise of lucrative construction contracts. My mother clapped the hardest, a wide, victorious smile plastered across her face. They truly believed they had won. They believed that public perception would override legal reality. Trey turned away from the podium and gestured to a large draped table positioned at the center of the stage. He invited the CEO of Horizon Developers and the mayor to step forward. "Today, right here on the ground where our family began, we are signing the binding contract to transfer this land to Horizon Developers." Trey announced, his eyes gleaming with unadulterated greed. "A $60 million investment in the future." The press photographers rushed the edge of the stage, their camera shutters firing like strobe lights. The CEO of Horizon Developers, a tall, imposing man, smiled and unrolled the massive ceremonial contract on the table. He produced a heavy gold-plated fountain pen and handed it directly to my brother. Trey took the pen. He looked out over the crowd, basking in the absolute pinnacle of his unearned glory. He leaned over the table, pressing the gold nib of the pen against the thick parchment paper. He was exactly one signature away from securing the cash he needed to hide his embezzlement. He never got to write the first letter. The low, rumbling roar of heavy, high-performance engines violently cut through the applause. The sound was not the standard hum of city traffic. It was the deep, synchronized growl of military machinery. The crowd turned their heads in unison. The press, photographers lowered their cameras, their lenses shifting toward the end of the block. Trey froze the gold pen, hovering a fraction of an inch above the paper. His arrogant smile slowly vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping shadow of confusion. A motorcade of 4 massive jet-black, heavily armored SUVs turned the corner and drove directly onto the restricted event grounds. They did not slow down for the police barricades. They did not stop for the event coordinators waving their clipboards. The lead SUV simply pushed through the plastic barriers, the heavy steel grille of the vehicle snapping them like twigs. The 4 vehicles rolled in perfect, intimidating formation, driving right down the center of the street and coming to a flawless, synchronized halt directly in front of the press stage. The sheer dominating presence of the motorcade sucked all the air out of the venue. The mayor took a nervous step backward. My mother's hands dropped to her sides. Her pristine white suit suddenly looking incredibly fragile against the imposing black vehicles. The doors of the 4 SUVs opened simultaneously. A dozen men and women stepped out onto the pavement. They were not wearing casual event attire. They were dressed in razor-sharp, immaculate corporate suits, carrying briefcases and leather portfolios. This was not a security detail. This was a tactical strike force composed of the most terrifying elite corporate litigators and federal compliance attorneys in the country. Victoria Sterling stepped out of the second vehicle. Adjusting her glasses, her face completely devoid of mercy. Then, the rear door of the lead SUV swung open. I stepped out onto the pavement. I was wearing a tailored, blood-red Powers suit that commanded the eye and completely dominated the visual space. I did not look like a disgraced rogue daughter. I looked like a woman who owned the ground I was walking on. I slowly closed the heavy car door behind me. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the absolute electrifying surge of power coursing through my veins. I looked up at the stage, my eyes locking directly onto my brother. The gold pen slipped from Trey's trembling fingers and clattered uselessly onto the table. His face drained of every ounce of blood, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He looked at the fleet of armored vehicles. He looked at the army of elite lawyers flanking my sides. And finally, he looked at me. The cameras began flashing furiously again, pivoting away from the golden child and focusing entirely on the woman who had just arrived to burn his empire to the ground. I did not walk. I marched. My heels struck the cracked pavement with rhythmic, unrelenting precision. Victoria Sterling matched my pace flawlessly on my right, clutching a thick, red-stamped leather portfolio against her chest. The Oak Haven private security contractors immediately fanned out, forming an impenetrable human wall between the press pool and the stage. The murmurs of the crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouted questions and rapid camera clicks. Trey's face morphed from ash and panic to a violent, desperate rage. He slammed his fist onto the wooden podium, leaning into the microphone. Security Trey bellowed his voice, cracking with panicked authority. "Remove this woman immediately. She has absolutely no authorization to be on this site. Officers arrest her for trespassing and disrupting a city-sanctioned event." 2 local beat cops stationed near the barricades took a hesitant step forward, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. Before they could even cross the threshold of the stage, my lead security contractor, a man the size of a commercial refrigerator, stepped directly into their path. He did not say a word. He simply crossed his arms. The officers stopped dead in their tracks, looking nervously between the giant blocking their path and the federal attorneys swarming the perimeter. "Get her out of here," Trey screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I have a court order. I am the legal conservator of this estate." I climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the stage. The Horizon Developer CEO took a very deliberate step backward, his eyes darting between my brother's unhinged meltdown and my absolute chilling calm. The mayor of Chicago, a man whose political survival depended on completely avoiding public scandals, was already whispering furiously to his chief of staff. edging his way toward the back stairs of the stage. "Yeah. What on earth is wrong with you?" my mother Lorraine hissed. Stepping forward with her hands planted firmly on her hips, her pristine white suit suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of an active corporate war zone. "You are ruining a historic moment for this family. You are humiliating your brother in front of the press. Go back to your little apartment and let the adults handle the real business." I ignored her entirely. I did not even grant her the dignity of making eye contact. My gaze was locked exclusively on the CEO of Horizon Developers. "Sir," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd without the need for a microphone. "If you sign that document, you are not closing a real estate deal. You are actively participating in a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme, federal racketeering, and the illegal liquidation of assets you have absolutely no claim to. I strongly suggest you put the pen down." The CEO looked at the heavy gold pen in his hand as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. He slowly placed it back onto the velvet-draped table. "Do not listen to her," Trey shouted, practically lunging across the table to grab the pen and shove it back toward the executive. "She is insane. She is a disgruntled unemployed, nobody who is upset. She was cut out of the family trust. I have the signed conservatorship right here. A state judge granted it to my father and me this morning. We have total legal authority to liquidate these assets." Trey waved a thin stack of papers in the air, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked manic. The carefully crafted illusion of the brilliant young developer had completely shattered, revealing the desperate cornered thief underneath. Victoria Sterling stepped up beside me. She did not yell. She did not wave her hands. She simply opened her leather portfolio and extracted a thick, heavily bound dossier sealed with the vibrant red wax stamp of the state Supreme Court. "Mr. Dubois," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the humid summer air with lethal precision. "That exarchy conservatorship order you are waving around is not worth the paper it is printed on. It was fundamentally fraudulent the moment you filed it, because you filed it against a man who is legally no longer your grandfather." The entire street went dead silent. The press corps stopped shouting. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. My father Elias finally broke his paralyzed silence. He stepped forward. His face flushed, a dangerous shade of crimson. "What kind of nonsensical garbage are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice thick with outrage. "Jeremiah Dubois is my father. I am his next of kin. I am his primary heir. You cannot change genetics with a cheap parlor trick. You cannot change genetics." "Elias," I agreed, turning to face the man who had spent his entire life trying to erase me. "But you can absolutely change the law. And Pops was significantly smarter than you ever gave him credit for." I took the red-stamped dossier from Victoria's hands. I held it up so the blinding flashes of the press cameras could capture every single detail of the official seal. 5 years ago, I announced, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the barricades, where the neighborhood residents were watching in stunned silence. Pops realized exactly what you and Trey were planning to do with his legacy. He saw the gambling debts. He saw the financial mismanagement. He knew that the second his health began to fail, you would vulture his life's work and sell this community to the highest bidder to cover your own catastrophic failures. Trey's jaw dropped. His eyes darted frantically around the stage, searching for an exit that did not exist. So, he took permanent, irrevocable action. I continued stepping closer to my father. He filed a petition with the state Supreme Court, a petition for adult adoption. 5 years ago, Jeremiah Dubois legally adopted me as his daughter. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. The reporters frantically began scribbling in their notepads, My mother stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in genuine, unfiltered shock. That is impossible. Elias choked out, gripping the edge of the podium to keep his knees from buckling. You are his granddaughter. You cannot just be adopted. In the state of Illinois, adult adoption is completely legal and requires exactly zero consent from any other family member. Victoria stated, delivering the legal death blow with the casual indifference of someone ordering a coffee. Upon the finalization of that adoption, Elias Dubois was legally and permanently severed as the primary next of KQN. Miss Nia Dubois became his first-line heir, his direct legal daughter, and the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. I turned back to Trey, watching the reality of his utter destruction finally penetrate his arrogant skull. You do not own this neighborhood, Trey? I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You do not own the laundromat. You do not own the apartment buildings. You do not own a single brick on this street. Immediately following the adoption, Pops transferred every single deed, every single title, and every single cent of his liquid capital into an irrevocable blind trust, a trust that I manage. As the sole executive director, Trey stood frozen, his eyes wide and vacant. The $60 million deal he needed to save his life had just vanished into thin air. This land cannot be sold, I announced to the crowd, staring directly into the lenses of the television cameras. It will never be sold to luxury developers. It will remain exactly what it was always intended to be, a cornerstone for this community. The CEO of Horizon Developers did not wait for another word. He grabbed his briefcase from the table, turned to his assistants, and began marching off the stage. Wait, Trey pleaded, lunging forward to grab the executive's sleeve. We can fix this. We can fight this in court. The contract is still good. The CEO yanked his arm away, shooting Trey a look of absolute disgust. You lied to me about your ownership of these assets. He snarled. You brought my firm into a fraudulent transaction on live television. You will be hearing from our corporate litigators before the end of the day. The executive stormed past the barricades, his departure acting as a signal for the mayor. The politician practically sprinted down the back stairs, flanked by his security detail, desperate to distance himself from the toxic fallout of the Dubois family implosion. Within 60 seconds, the grand stage had transformed into a monument of utter humiliation. My mother was hyperventilating. She grabbed Elias by the arm, shaking him violently. Do something, Lane shrieked. Perfectly maintained facade, shattering into a million pathetic pieces. She stole everything. Tell them to arrest her. Elias could not move. He was staring at the red-stamped dossier in my hands, as if it were a venomous snake. The realization that his own father had legally downed him, choosing the daughter he had cast aside, had completely broken his mind. Trey let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. He turned to me, his eyes bloodshot and manic. You ruined my life. He spat, spit flying from his lips. I needed that. Money. You have no idea what you have done. I know exactly what I have done. Trey, I replied, stepping right into his personal space. I know about the $5 million missing from the commercial trust. I know about the offshore transfers to Macau. And I know about the federal audit scheduled for next week. Trey stopped breathing. You thought you could bury your embezzlement under $60 million of Horizon cash, I whispered, ensuring only he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. But the money is gone. The sale is dead. And the auditors are already reviewing the files I sent them 30 minutes ago. Trey dropped to his knees right there on the wooden stage. He did not cry. He just stared blankly at the ground. A man completely and totally erased. The silence on the stage lasted only a fraction of a second before my mother shattered it. Lorraine lunged forward, her pristine white heels clicking frantically against the wood. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my blazer. "You, Arealiar." She shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing through the microphone Trey had abandoned. Jeremiah would never do such a thing. He would never choose a bitter, ungrateful girl over his own son and grandson. "You forged those documents. I will have you thrown in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." I looked down at the hand clawing at my sleeve. I did not pull away. I simply stared at it with such absolute freezing contempt that my mother instinctively recoiled, her hand dropping back to her side as if she had been burned. The documents were authenticated by the state Supreme Court 5 years ago. "Lorraine," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying, measured calm. 5 years ago, when Pops was completely sound of mind. 5 years ago, when he watched his own son hand the keys of the Dubois legacy over to a boy who could not even balance a checkbook. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he did it to protect this family from you. Elias stepped up beside his wife, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of hollow authority. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "You manipulated a sick old man," Elias sneered, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You poisoned him against his own blood. You are a parasite." "Yeah, but this little stunt changes nothing. I am still his biological son. I will tie this up in probate court for the next 2 decades. I will drain every cent of that trust in legal fees before I ever let you see a dime of it." "Victoria." Sterling stepped smoothly between my father and me, a lethal smile playing on her lips. "You are welcome to try." "Mr. Dubois," Victoria said, her tone dripping with professional mockery. "But to tie something up in probate court, you need capital to pay a legal team. And as of this morning, your personal accounts have been frozen, pending a federal investigation into wire fraud and corporate embezzlement." Trey, who had been staring blankly at the floor, suddenly snapped. The catatonic shock shattered, replaced instantly by the wild, thrashing desperation of a drowning man. He scrambled to his feet. His tailored suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked less like a corporate visionary and more like a feral animal. "Shut up," Trey screamed, his voice cracking violently as he stepped toward Victoria. "You shut your mouth. You have no idea what you are talking about. I am the CEO of the Dubois Commercial Trust. I run the accounts. I make the deals. I am the one who built this portfolio. You did not build anything." "Trey," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting. "You inherited a masterpiece, and you pawned it for casino chips." I turned away from my brother and looked over at the massive LED screen positioned at the back of the stage. For the past hour, it had been displaying a glittering, high-define architectural rendering of the Anu Dubois Legacy Luxury Condominium Complex. It was a pristine fake image of glass and steel, completely erasing the history of the neighborhood we were standing in. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, subtle nod to the Oakhaven security contractor standing near the audiovisual booth at the edge of the barricades. The contractor tapped a sequence into his tablet. The giant LED screen behind us violently flickered. The bright, sunny image of the luxury condos glitched, dissolving into a jagged pattern of static. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of press and politicians as the screen suddenly went pitch black. A second later, it flared back to life. But it was no longer showing a real estate mock-up. The screen was now broadcasting the highly classified, deeply encrypted internal financial ledgers of the Dubois Commercial Trust. The documents I had pulled from my secure server room just an hour ago were now displayed in towering, unmistakable, high definition for the entire city of Chicago to see. My parents turned around to look at the screen. The remaining city council members in the front row stood up from their folding chairs, their mouths falling open in horror. The press photographers went absolutely wild. The rapid-fire clicking of their camera shutters sounding like a swarm of locusts as they documented the financial ruin of the Dubois family in real time. "What is this?" Elias demanded, his voice trembling as he stared up at the massive columns of numbers. "Turn that off. Turn that screen off right now." He lunged toward the audiovisual booth. But two of my massive private security guards effortlessly blocked his path. Crossing their arms and staring him down, Elias bounced off them like a bird, hitting a window pane, stumbling backward in utter defeat. "Let us take a look at your brilliant leadership." "Trey," I announced, walking over to the podium and pulling the microphone from its stand. I turned to face the crowd, gesturing to the towering screen behind me. "What you are looking at is the absolute destruction of a 60-year-old family legacy. Right there, highlighted in red, is a total operational deficit of $5 million. The crowd began to murmur loudly, the neighborhood residents behind the barricades. The people who had been terrified of losing their homes were now watching their oppressor being publicly humiliated. "You are not a brilliant investor." "Trey," I said, turning back to look my brother dead in the eyes. The microphone amplified my voice, projecting my words with a cold unrelenting clarity that left no room for argument. "You are a thief. You are a degenerate gambler who thought he could use our grandfather's blood, sweat, and tears to cover his own pathetic mistakes. That is fake." Trey screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. He pointed frantically at the screen. "She fabricated those documents. It is a lie." I tapped the screen control remote in my hand. The image zoomed in, highlighting a specific series of transactions. "Is this a lie?" I asked, reading the text directly from the screen. A200 000 wire transfer to an offshore holding account in Macau. Authorized by your digital signature. How about this one? A shadow mortgage taken out against the very laundromat we are standing in front of, with a 30% interest rate, payable to an unlicensed lending syndicate in Las Vegas. Trey was hyperventilating. He backed away from the screen as if it were emitting radiation. "And let us not forget the operational expenses." I continued mercilessly tapping the remote again. The screen shifted to display Harper's credit card statements, paid directly from the commercial trust. 50美元 000 a month on private jet charters. 30美元 000 to a diamond broker in Antwerp. A200 000 retreat to a Swiss medical spa. I looked down at the front row of VIP seating. Harper was sitting there wearing a pale pink Chanel suit, her face completely drained of color. The other wealthy wives and socialites surrounding her physically pulled away, shifting their chairs to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Harper tried to cover her face with her designer handbag, shrinking down in her seat as the press cameras pivoted to capture her humiliation. "You were going to sell out grandfather's legacy," I said, my voice echoing off the brick, building's addressing Trey with an absolute fatal disgust. "You were going to bulldoze the homes of hundreds of hardworking families. You were going to lock the man who raised you into a psychiatric ward, strip him of his human rights, and steal his life. And you were going to do all of it just to save your own ragged reputation and fund the shopping habits of your gold-digging wife." Lorraine let out a sharp, devastated wail. She looked at the screen, then at Trey, the horrific reality of her golden child finally breaking through decades of deliberate, willful ignorance. "Trey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell me this is not true. Tell me she is lying." Trey could not look at our mother. He could not look at Elias. He stood trembling on the stage, entirely stripped of his armor, exposed to the glaring daylight as the fraud he had always been. "This neighborhood is not for sale," I announced, turning my back on my ruined family and speaking directly to the residents standing behind the police. "Barricades. The Dubois legacy will not be defined by greed, embezzlement, or the destruction of our own people. As the legal owner of these properties, I am officially freezing all rents. I am allocating $10 million from Oak Haven Partners to fully renovate every single apartment building on this block without displacing a single family." The residents stared at me in stunned silence for a brief moment. Then a single person started clapping. It spread like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire crowd of locals erupted into deafening cheers. They were screaming my name, applauding the preservation of their homes and the absolute downfall of the men who had tried to destroy them. The corrupt politicians and the greedy developers were silently fleeing the scene, slipping away down the side streets to avoid the incoming federal investigation. The press corps was entirely focused on the giant digital billboard of crimes and the cheering crowd of victorious citizens. My father sank into a folding chair on the stage, burying his face in his hands, completely broken by the realization that his legacy was gone. His favorite son was a criminal, and the daughter he had treated like dirt was now the undisputed ruler of his world. I handed the microphone back to Victoria. I smoothed the lapels of my blood-red suit. The chaotic roar of the crowd, serving as the perfect soundtrack to my victory. I did not need their apologies. I did not need their love. I had taken back what was mine, and I had left them with absolutely nothing. The collective gasp of the press corps was momentarily drowned out by the sharp, frantic clicking of a woman's heels storming up the wooden steps of the stage. Harper was practically vibrating with rage. The pale pink Chanel suit she wore, purchased with the very funds my grandfather had bled to build, looked suddenly cheap. As she shoved her way past the stunned city officials, she stood over her husband, who was still staring vacantly at the floorboards, and grabbed him by the shoulder, trying to yank him to his feet. "Get up," Trey Harper hissed, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the polished country club grace she usually projected. "Do not let her do this to you. She is lying. She is just a jealous, bitter woman, trying to steal your spotlight." Trey did not move. He was a hollow shell, his brain completely short-circuiting under the weight of his own exposed crimes. Harper let go of his jacket in disgust and whipped around to face me. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with a terrifying manic denial. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "What right do you have to come here and ruin this contract?" Harper shrieked, her voice echoing through the open plaza. "You think you are so smart with your little trust fund trick. You think you have cornered us. You have nothing. We do not need this specific developer. Vanguard Group already agreed to completely fund our next 3 commercial phases. They guaranteed a $50 million credit line yesterday afternoon. We do not need this neighborhood." I stood perfectly still, letting her shrill voice bounce off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. The television cameras instantly pivoted, racking focus from Harper's pale, desperate face to my own calm, unwavering smile. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for. The final nail in the coffin. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, making sure every single lens in the press pool was tracking my hand. I pulled out a thick, matte black business card, heavily embossed with gleaming gold lettering. I walked over to the draped table, completely ignoring the voided contract sitting next to the discarded fountain pen, and dropped the card onto the surface. The heavy cardstock landed with a distinct, satisfying thud. "You are absolutely right, Harper," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, lethal conversational tone. Vanguard Group did agree to underwrite Trey's commercial debt. They approved a massive, highly leveraged credit line to keep him afloat. They saw a desperate man willing to sign over his life, and they took the deal. Harper crossed her arms, lifting her chin with a triumphant, mocking sneer. "So you can take your fake adoption papers and get out of our sight," she demanded. "We are fully funded. We are untouchable." I tilted my head, letting a cold laugh escape my lips. "You really should learn to read the financial disclosures before you spend money. You do not have Harper," I stated, stepping closer to the table and tapping the gold lettering on the business card. "Vanguard Group did agree to fund you, but exactly 1 week ago, a private equity firm executed a hostile takeover and purchased an 80% controlling stake in Vanguard." Harper's triumphant sneer faltered. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides. "That private equity firm is Oak Haven Partners." I continued enunciating every syllable, so the microphones picked it up perfectly. "And I, Nia Dubois, am the founder, the primary shareholder, and the sole chief executive officer of Oak Haven." I paused, letting the absolute horror of the situation wash over her face. I watched the color completely drain from her cheeks as the math finally clicked in her head. "I do not just control my grandfather's trust," I whispered, leaning forward, so my voice sliced directly through her delusion. "I own Vanguard, which means as of right now, I am your primary creditor. You do not owe a faceless corporation $50 million. You owe it to me." My father let out a strangled prod, breathless sound from his chair, finally realizing that I had not just anticipated their moves, I had actively financed their trap. I had let them borrow the rope they were now using to hang themselves. And as the primary debt holder, I announced, turning my gaze back to Trey, who was now staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "I have reviewed the fraudulent terms under which this loan was secured. You used assets you did not legally own as collateral. That is a direct violation of the covenants. Therefore, I am officially calling in the debt immediately in full." "No," Harper gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. "You cannot do that. We need 30 days. We have a grace period. You have absolutely nothing." I corrected her sharply. Calling in a loan of that magnitude with zero liquid assets triggers an automatic, unappealable default. "Do you understand what that means for your perfectly curated life, Harper?" I took a step toward her, forcing her to retreat until her back hit the wooden railing of the stage. "It means your bank accounts are currently being frozen by federal regulators," I told her, my voice relentless. "It means the 6-bedroom estate in Lake Forest is going into immediate foreclosure. It means the G-Wagon you drove here today will be repossessed by tomorrow morning. It means every single diamond on your wrist and every designer bag in your closet is going to be seized to pay back the money you and your husband stole from my grandfather. You are not a high society elite anymore. You are utterly, completely broke. Trey, you are officially bankrupt." The reality of the devastation hit the stage like a seismic shockwave. My mother, Lorraine, let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She rushed toward Elias, grabbing his lapels and shaking him frantically. "Fix this." "Elias," she wailed, tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. "Ruining her makeup. She is taking everything. She is going to leave us with nothing. Fix it right now." But Elias could only stare at me, his eyes wide and vacant, completely paralyzed by the realization that his lifelong campaign to diminish and discard me had ultimately engineered his own destruction. He had spent his entire life worshiping Trey, grooming him to be a king. And in doing so, he had handed his kingdom to a fool. Harper's mind completely snapped. She looked at the reporters who were furiously documenting every second of her downfall. She let out an ear-piercing, unhing shriek, dropping to the floor and grabbing Trey by the collar of his ruined suit. "Do something," Harper screamed violently, shaking my brother. "You told me we were safe. You promised me the money was secure. You worthless, pathetic liar. You ruined my life." Trey did not fight back. He did not defend himself. The golden child, the man who had walked onto this stage, believing he owned the city of Chicago, simply collapsed forward. His knees hit the wooden floorboards with a heavy thud. He slumped over his head, resting in his hands, completely unresponsive to his wife's frantic screaming and the blinding flash of a 100 camera lenses. The press pool surged forward against the barricades, fighting for the best angle of the fallen Dubois heir. Reporters were shouting my name, asking for quotes, begging for an exclusive interview about the most spectacular corporate assassination the city had seen in decades. I did not answer them. I simply turned my back on the stage, walking down the steps with Victoria and my security team surrounding me. I left my family exactly where they belonged, on their knees, drowning in the wreckage of their own greed, completely at the mercy of the world they had tried to destroy. I had barely reached the reinforced doors of my armored SUV when the distant, unmistakable shriek of federal sirens began to slice through the heavy Chicago heat. The sound did not build gradually. It tore into the plaza, a rising, violent crescendo of absolute finality. I paused, resting my hand against the cool, polished metal of the doorframe, and turned back to watch the final act of the tragedy Trey had written for himself. 2 dark blue seed ends and a massive mobile command unit violently breached the intersection, their tires screeching against the cracked asphalt as they jumped the curb. They cut off the exact exit route the local politicians had just utilized, sealing the perimeter with ruthless military efficiency. The heavy doors burst open before the vehicles even came to a complete halt. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, swarmed the street, moving with a synchronized predatory grace. The press pool, sensing a story that would dominate the national news cycle and make careers overnight, immediately pivoted their heavy lenses away from the digital billboard and aimed them directly at the stage. The camera flashes morphed into a solid, blinding wall of white strobe lights, illuminating the dust hanging in the humid air. Elias and Lorraine stood frozen on the wooden planks, their faces contorted in abject, paralyzing horror as the federal agents marched up the steps. The Oak Haven security contractors smoothly stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea, to grant the federal authorities unrestricted access to the crime scene. The lead agent, a tall, uncompromising woman with a silver badge clipped to her belt and a thick manila folder in her hand, did not bother with pleasantries or introductions. She did not care about the Dubois name or the bespoke suits. Trey Dubois, she announced, her voice booming with an icy authority that commanded absolute silence from the chaotic crowd. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, gross embezzlement, corporate racketeering, and the illegal transfer of assets. Trey did not run. He did not protest. He could not even stand. His legs gave out entirely, his knees buckling beneath the weight of his absolute ruin. Two federal agents stepped forward, gripping him firmly by the armpits and hauling his limp, shaking body upward. The metallic heavy click of the steel handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, echoed through the open microphones. Still sitting on the podium, broadcasting the sound of his lost freedom across the entire neighborhood, Harper had been standing frozen near the velvet-draped table, her eyes darting frantically between the federal agents and her handcuffed husband. The moment she heard the metal click of the cuffs, something feral and terrifying snapped inside her brain. The carefully constructed mask of the refined, progressive, high society philanthropist melted away in an instant, exposing the venomous parasitic core underneath. Self-preservation kicked in, overriding any shred of loyalty, marital vows, or basic human decency. She scrambled backward, her expensive Chanel heels catching on the wooden planks, nearly sending her sprawling. "Do not touch me," Harper shrieked violently, batting away an agent who reached out to guide her away from the edge of the stage. She looked at Trey. She did not look at him with pity or sorrow or even anger. She looked at him with visceral, unadulterated disgust. It was the look of a woman staring at a contagious disease. She grabbed her left hand violently, twisting the massive 6-carat diamond engagement ring and the heavy platinum wedding band off her finger. She did not just drop them. She hurled them directly at Trey's face with all the force she could muster. The heavy diamond struck his cheekbone, leaving a sharp red scratch before clattering uselessly onto the stage and rolling toward the edge of the stairs. "I have absolutely nothing to do with him," Harper screamed at the press pool, her voice completely unhinged, spittle flying from her lips as she desperately tried to control the narrative. "I am the victim here. I am a victim. I was scammed by this fraudulent black man." The entire street gasped in unison. The collective intake of breath was loud enough to rival the sirens. The ugly, vile truth was finally out, completely unvarnished, and captured by dozens of high-define cameras. The woman who had happily spent millions of dollars stolen from a historic black community. The woman who had smiled for the social pages while tearing down the Dubois legacy was now using her husband's race as a weapon to distance herself from his crimes. She had gladly taken the Dubois money, but she had always fundamentally despised the Dubois blood. "Look at him," Harper continued to rant, her face flushed and distorted with racist panic as reporters shoved microphones closer to catch every toxic word. "High as a criminal. He lied to me about everything. I belong in Lake Forest. I do not belong in this ghetto with these people. I am not a part of this." The local residents standing behind the police barricades erupted. The people who had watched this family exploit them for years began to boo and shout back at her, their voices rising into a deafening tide of righteous anger. The police officers stationed at the perimeter had to physically step forward, bracing their boots and holding the steel barricades steady as the community directed their absolute fury at the woman insulting them on their own streets. Trey looked up at his wife. The physical blow of the thrown diamonds was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic devastation of her words. He had committed federal crimes for her. He had stolen from his own grandfather, risked federal prison, and sold his soul just to fund her private jets, her diamonds, and her endless, insatiable greed. And the exact second the money vanished, she stripped him of his humanity, reduced him to a racist caricature, and fed him to the wolves just to save her own skin. He opened his mouth to speak, his lips trembling, but no sound came out. The golden child. The brilliant prodigy, was completely hollowed out. He was a dead man breathing. Elias lunged forward, his face purple with rage. "How dare you?" he roared, reaching out to grab Harper's arm. "You spent every dime he brought home. You are just as guilty as he is." An FBI agent swiftly shoved Elias back, planting a firm hand in the center of his chest. "Step back, Sir," the agent warned his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "Interfere with this arrest, and you will be in the back of a vehicle, right next to him." Lorraine was openly sobbing now, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She looked at Trey in handcuffs. She looked at the screaming, bigoted daughter-in-law she had previously worripped, and she looked at the towering digital screen that was still broadcasting the undeniable proof of their crimes. Her perfect elite family was publicly disintegrating into a disgraceful spectacle of bigotry and federal indictments. She sank to the floor of the stage, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. I stood perfectly still by my vehicle, watching the scene unfold with an absolute freezing calm. Victoria Sterling stood beside me, her arms crossed, her eyes tracking the federal agents as they secured the area. The FBI agents began marching Trey down the wooden steps of the stage. His head hung so low, his chin rested against his chest. He looked incredibly small. The tailored Navy suit hung off his frame like a borrowed costume on a frightened child. As he was paraded past the barricades, the residents of the Southside District, the People Pops, spent his life protecting the people Trey had tried to sell to the highest bidder, suddenly went completely silent. They did not yell at him. They did not throw garbage. They simply watched him. Their silent, piercing judgment was infinitely worse than any shouted insult. It was the ultimate absolute eraser of Trey Dubois from the community he had betrayed. An agent placed a hand on Trey's head, pushing him down into the back seat of a dark SUV. The heavy door slammed shut, a resounding metallic boom that officially severed him from the world he had tried to conquer. Harper was still screaming at the press, her voice cracking and hoarse, as two federal agents flanked her. They were not arresting her yet, but they were loudly advising her that she was required for questioning regarding her knowledge of the offshore accounts and her signature on several joint tax returns. The panic in her eyes amplified as she realized that ripping off her ring did not sever her legal liability. The empire of lies was reduced to ashes. The golden child was gone. The racist parasite was cornered, and the enablers were left weeping on the floor of a stage they did not own. I turned away from the chaos, opened the door of my vehicle, and stepped inside. 3 days later, the air in my office was deathly still. A stark contrast to the chaotic screaming plaza of the arrest. I was reviewing the preliminary liquidation report when the intercom buzzed. My assistant's voice was tight with suppressed annoyance. "Mr. and Mrs. Dubois are in the lobby, Nia. They refuse to leave. They are causing a scene with the reception staff. Let them up," I said, my voice ice cold. A moment later, the double oak doors swung open. Elias and Lorraine stumbled in looking like ghosts of the people they had been just 72 hours ago. Their expensive clothes were disheveled, their skin sallow and gray. They did not look like the untouchable monarchs of the Chicago real estate scene anymore. They looked like two people who had just realized their entire reality was a lie. "Nia, pleased," Lorraine sobbed, dropping to her knees on the plush office carpet. She scrambled forward, her hands outstretched in a pathetic, desperate plea. "You have to save him. Trey is falling apart in that holding cell. He is not eating. He is terrified. He is your brother. We are your family. You cannot just let the federal government destroy him." Elias remained standing, but he was trembling so violently he had to grip the back of a leather guest chair for support. Yeah. I am begging. You. He rasped, his arrogance completely stripped away. Drop the charges. Use your influence with the district attorney. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding, that you have reconciled the accounts. We can pay the $5 million back. We will sell the beach house. We will sell everything. Just get him out before the trial starts. I leaned back in my high-backed chair, watching them gravel. It was a pathetic sight. The man who had spent years telling me I was nothing, the woman who had only ever loved me when I was useful, to her image, now reduced to shaking. Weeping wreckage at my feet. You talk about family as if it is a magic word that fixes everything, I said. My voice steady, devoid of any warmth. You talk about blood as if it is a blank check for unlimited forgiveness. But you never cared about family when you were busy signing my grandfather's name to fake documents. You never cared about family when you were planning to commit me to a psychiatric ward to steal my home. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single crumpled piece of paper. It was the flyer Harper had shoved into my hand weeks ago. An advertisement for a cheap fly-by-night nail technician certification course. She had intended it as a final insult. A way to remind me of the lowly social status she thought I belonged in. I held it out toward them. I don't need your apologies. And I certainly don't need your tears. I said, you came here asking for a way to save Trey. Here is your solution. I tossed the flyer onto the carpet between them. Trey needs a high-end defense attorney if he wants to avoid a 10-year sentence. Those lawyers cost thousands of dollars an hour. You have lost your assets. Your credit is in the sewer, and the trust is completely locked. You need a job. Both of you. Take this course. Get certified. And start working at a salon. It is honest, physical labor. It might even teach you the value of $1 for the first time in your lives. My mother stared at the cheap paper, her face contorting in genuine horror. You want us to work in a nail salon, she whispered, her voice full of elitist disgust. We are the Dubois family. We do not do manual labor. You are a felon's parents. I corrected. And you are officially dead to me. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Security. Please remove these people from the building. 2 of my private guards stepped into the office. Their faces impassive. My father tried to protest, to invoke some final pathetic remnant of his authority. But the guards did not hesitate. They gripped Elias and Lorraine by the arms and efficiently steered them toward the door. As they were dragged out, Lorraine's shrieks of entitlement echoed down the hallway, slowly fading until the heavy doors slammed shut. Sealing the office in a final blissful silence, I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city I now truly owned. The Dubois family name had been a heavy, suffocating cage for my entire life. I had finally burned it down, and the air had never felt cleaner. The morning sun climbed over the Chicago skyline, casting a golden, forgiving glow over the historic South Side district from the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse. The view was unrecognizable from the bleak, decaying landscape Trey had once intended to bulldoze. Instead of the sterile, towering luxury high-rises, he had promised the neighborhood was alive with the sound of restoration. Scaffolding framed the original brick structures, and the vibrant mural of our family history was being carefully retouched by a local collective. Pops sat in his wicker chair, a thick wool blanket draped over his lap, the autumn breeze playing with his thinning white hair. He was no longer the frail, confused man Trey had tried to commit. His eyes were sharp with a pride that had been dormant for decades. He reached out his weathered, calloused hand, patting my forearm with a steady, firm pressure. The laundromat is thriving again, Nyapop said, his voice raspy but clear. And the apartment buildings are full of life. You didn't just save these walls. You saved the people who live inside them. You protected the only legacy that ever really mattered. I leaned back, resting my head against the cool metal of the balcony railing. I watched a group of neighborhood kids playing soccer in the renovated community park. The laughter rising up to meet us. My transition from the rogue granddaughter to the sole steward of the Dubois Trust had been a brutal high-stakes war. But looking at this city, I knew the cost had been worth every cent. You protected it all. Pops, I said. I just finished the job you started. He chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the chair. You did more than finish it. Yeah, you made it yours. I turned away from the view, picking up a crystal flute of vintage champagne from the small table beside me. The liquid caught the morning sun, burning a deep amber gold. I looked directly into the camera lens, the glass cold against my lips. A slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. The kind of smile that had terrified my father and broken my brother. The Dubois name was a heavy, suffocating cage they tried to use to break me. I said, my voice cutting through the quiet morning air with absolute finality. They said I wasn't worthy of the name. They were right. I didn't come here to carry it. I came to conquer it. I don't belong to the family legacy anymore. I own it.